A lack of boundaries often leads to an imbalance. Whether we're speaking personally or professionally, it's important to set and maintain those boundaries. Boundaries will help you know and claim what is and what is not your responsibility while honoring your values. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Thoughtful Talents Show. I'm Jen Werner of Jen Werner Coaching.
And I'm Chad Ahern of Talent Teams Consulting. And today we are here to talk about setting boundaries and work-life balance. Jen, why are we talking about this topic in the world of work where we are today in 2024?
Yeah, I think we hear about work-life balance all the time, right? So setting boundaries and finding that work-life balance really comes down to understanding your values. At least that's where it comes for me. That's the easiest way for me to set boundaries, is for me to be thinking about my values. So what's most important to you? And I have a few examples. So if you want to just take a minute while we're talking and just think about this, are some of your values family, integrity, achievement, autonomy, maybe justice, humanity, or knowledge? If you had to choose just two of those, what would they be? And what does that really mean to you? So I think this is a really great place to start to understand your own personal values. It helps you inform your needs and respect yourself so that you're able to set boundaries. Those guardrails we talked a lot about in season 1, always having our guardrails around our talents, around what you will and won't do. Maybe even being able to honor your own values and then meet the needs of your talents without completely losing balance. Chad, I know there's some really great statistics out there that came from Gallup and some other sources. Do you want to share those with us?
Yeah, so I think one of the, you talk a lot about why this is important. It's about balancing the values and your environment and what you do and don't want to do in the work life, in your work and in your life. I think this is also a really important topic right now. And the reason why Jen and I are doing this podcast on this topic is that according to Gallup, 76% of full-time hybrid workers in the US most often cite improved work-life balance as top advantage of hybrid work. So we're talking about, we've moved from sort of the pre-COVID time of, everybody was essentially required to work 9 to 5. We're starting to see some changes, and that integration and balance is going to be really important. What's really interesting is actually, if you look at people who are exclusively remote, 85% of workers say that that improved work-life balance is amongst the greatest benefits of remote work.
Oh, yeah. And that's the stat I can get behind, Chad. Being a fully remote worker, like commute time is now gone. So that means if there's something that I want to do with my family, it's literally shutting the computer and walking away. It's not, now I have a half-hour drive. If it's at 5 o'clock, there's no way I'm getting home in a half hour. It completely changed my work-life balance. In order for me to give more time to just do those things that meant more to me, I also have those tendencies where I'm like, oh, I work really well, like from 5 to 7 p.m. because no one's at the office and no one's bothering me. It's just as quiet at home. So some of those times that I used to do that staying late because it was quiet, now I can do that from home. And I don't feel like now I've completely neglected my family because now we don't get to have dinner until I get home. So I 100% can agree and feel to that one specifically.
So there's some other stats though. So we talked about remote and hybrid work. But I think one of the real concerns here, as much as some of the remote and hybrid work have helped a lot of people, 60% of US workers agree with the statement that they don't have work-life boundaries. 60%. So that's a little concerning. 40% of US workers consider themselves workaholics. And that's 48% of US workers consider themselves workaholics, and 40% of people say poor work-life balance is impacting or even ruins the time that they spend with their family and friends. So this is a whole big ball of wax.
Yeah, it is, because it's that now if I'm working from home or I have my computer at home and someone emails me or texts me about something, I have the ability to jump on my computer and address that like emergency right now, right? But
Yeah.
then you've just left, like physically left, emotionally, physically left your family and whatever you were doing to now be like focused on the work things again. I think it's still so important to set and keep boundaries so that you don't get, swept up in the ease of being able to never shut off work. Like you still have to have, like we talked about that in our last episode, when we talked about burnout, being able to step away and actually shut off work is really important. And I think that speaks to this like imbalance that we feel. For me, and I love that statistic about the 60% say that they don't have those good boundaries between work and home, because for me those like loose boundaries and that lack of balance were a recipe straight to burnout. My own personal loose boundaries led me to like agree to take on more challenges. I know you're shocked at that with my responsibility and achiever high. And then, but honestly, I was choosing work over my family and my own well-being a lot. I just think that's something that we can really get into if you're, especially those fully remote workers. You still have to make those good boundaries for yourself about what is work time and what is not.
And I think this is another place where some clarity of language can help. We've already started this episode using the phrase work-life balance,
Yep.
but I actually think, and I've come across this from some other authors and podcasts, is I think the term that we should really be exploring is work-life integration. It doesn't necessarily have to be a pure balance of hour per hour. As much as my analytical talents love the numbers behind all, everything, and
Yes.
stats like
Making
what
the
I just
equal.
shared, making it equal. Harmony plays a role maybe in that feeling. But I've come to learn, and I think it's worth our listeners and our leaders that are listening to this really considering, is it a balance or is it an integration? How are you teaching those aspects of your life, work, um, your home life, your community life, your time with friends, your time, by yourself even. How do those
Yeah.
all get layered together to complete? Not even layered. Sort of, how do you make your pie chart, so that
Yeah.
everything kind of has a place? So I just, as much as we might keep using work-life balance throughout the rest of this episode, I really encourage our listeners to think about integration,
Yeah.
because there are going to be some times in our lives where you do need to put a little bit more effort in to work. And as long as there's an understanding around that, then the family or those most important to you understand, okay, this is a busy time for me. I need a little bit more time with work. But then there are other times where, oh, family's really got to take precedent, and that gets amped up a little bit. So it's not about consistently maintaining a daily or weekly balance. It's about how it all gets integrated. I can
Yeah.
speak a little bit to my personal experience. Is Gallup uses these phrases, blenders and splitters, right?
Oh,
So
yes.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
so blenders tend to kind of, to a certain extent, go with the flow. They'll work a little bit, and then maybe they need to address a personal matter, or go to a doctor's appointment, or they need to go to a family function for an hour or so, and then they come back, and then they do work some more, and then they maybe um blend again, and they're off doing something that's non-work related. Whereas splitters, as Gallup defines it, are really the people that love at 9 o'clock I start my work, at 5 o'clock I end my work, and I take care of all the family and friends and community activities outside of that 9 to 5 window. And Jen and I will be including a link to that blender splitters definitions in our show notes. But I can say for myself, I'm a bit of a blender, and I'm the person that blends life. I wake up and I work in the morning to early afternoon, then go take care of my kids from like 2 to 7, when we take care of family time and dinner and getting kids to bed and so forth. And then, because I'm a bit of a night owl, I'll tend to pick work back up after everybody's in bed, because that's also where you talked about values and where you get your energy. Um, I value that time to myself, and that my energy tends to come later in the evening than it does first thing in the morning. And so I tend to blend. Now, my discipline loves to have sort of a schedule to that. There is a,
Yeah.
some might look at it as regimented um, take on that blending, but it is a blend because I will pop out or I will modify my day to, go to a doctor's appointment or take my kids someplace that they need to be. Um, so there are different versions of blender. I like to think of it as
Right.
I'm sort of like a yogurt parfait before you mix it all together. So there's like the yogurt, the fruit, the yogurt, the fruits and nuts, and then the yogurt again. So I have a little bit of a more of a structure. Jen, what about you? Would you define yourself as a blender, a splitter, a little bit of combination of the two?
I would say I feel like I probably am a blender, but only now because I've gotten much better with my boundaries. I used to really need to be a splitter. So I still
Hmm.
love having that like hard stop line. When I've decided work is done for the day, I'm done. I don't want to be drugged back in. Like, don't text me and ask me to like get back on my computer after I've already shut it down. Like, if it's shut down, I'm not even having to go as far as removing my email notifications on my phone, because if I
Hmm.
see it, I have this, that activator comes out. I have this instinctive like reflex to respond to it right away. And then my responsibility was like, they're waiting for me. But I think we talked about this before too. Just because someone sends you an email at 9 o'clock at night doesn't mean they actually want the answer right now. They might just be like, oh, it's on my mind. I'm going to shoot you a message. And then when you have time, you can look at it. So I think as my boundaries have gotten better, really understanding my own values and what is important to me and how to set those, I've become a lot more of a blender. But I would say, if you, in my own opinion, if you aren't great at setting boundaries right now, you might want to start as being a splitter and maybe lean more into those blending abilities as you start to get more comfortable. Because otherwise, I know for me, when I was blending a lot, I liked jumping from one thing to the other and going throughout the day, being able to take care of, a doctor's appointment or, take the dog for a walk, and in between have all my other time to do work, maybe even taking a yoga class. But what I felt like is at the end of the day, I was always working. I
Hmm.
felt like I was always working, even though I had those times where I was doing other things. There was something about that for me, and it made it really difficult. I need that time still to be, excuse me, a little more specific and hard lined, like you said. Like those lines of those hours in between can be taken to be, for blending time, but I really want that work time to have an end, so that I know that I'm done for the day.
That's interesting. A bunch of thoughts are hitting me all at the same time. First of all, one about the blenders and splitters that each person and as we said, we'll include the article in our show notes,
Yeah.
but people do tend to have one distinct work style, and it usually
Hmm.
stays with them for most of their working life. Obviously, we learn and grow, and they meet different
Yep.
needs, and you need to re-examine it. But you do have a preference, and I think one of the things that one of the reasons we're doing this episode right after the burnout is that if that doesn't match your company or team's expectations, it's a recipe for burnout.
Yep.
Because your sense of boundaries are different than your environments, and that
Hmm.
creates a sort of a natural conflict that is unfortunately probably not a positive one. Um,
Right.
so that was interesting. Both you and I have talked about so kind of morphing our work styles a little bit. I think part of mine, and this is actually where, excuse me, some of our talents can start to hurt us, is that
Right.
if we morph too far away from our natural style. So I've got harmony talents, so I tend to, maybe bend a little bit more to the needs of others, just so that there's a consensus and I'm on the team, and
Yep.
portraying a team player. um, I'll move in that direction. But that might not necessarily be beneficial for me personally in my level of burnout
Right.
or engagement. So again, listeners, think about your own style and then think about the style that's kind of being, I won't say imposed, but what is the
Yeah.
natural order of your organization or your team, and what does that look like? And really take a look at that. Are the boundary settings in about the same places, or are you working with two very different sets of people? Um, just back to talents for a second, my responsibility again, if the request is that everybody be there between certain times, I've always felt the need to fulfill that sort of promise or that expectation of people. At times that has ended up hurting my relationships with my work, my family, my friends, etc. I had a job a while ago that required quite a commute, and that I thought was a worthwhile thing to take on, but it was very much a splitter environment, and that did not tend to support my blending style, my personal blending styles. So it's just again something to think about where our talents start to intersect with our work styles, um, and setting those boundaries. So
Yeah, and
I've
I
got a
loved what
little
you
bit.
did in the oh no, I thought that was great, and it reminded me of what you brought into our last episode about burnout, because you were talking about how your talents, even though they're great, they can lead you to burnout if you're not super careful. So again, not having those boundaries set, not understanding your values, and then really spending the time to make and set those boundaries around what you can handle, what you can't, and what you should be handling versus what's someone else's responsibility. I think that's where I went to this, thinking about this in our talents. I used your example from our last episode because I think, as I shared before, when I leaned too strong on my talents with those loose boundaries, it really became an issue for me. I have a lot of executing strengths high. So, like my responsibility, I'm going to use three of them. My responsibility, like I know the need of this talent is to take full ownership. So I would just say yes to every request that came my way. And this really didn't leave any room for others to help me, for me to do what actually needed to be done. And in some ways, I could have been taking the opportunity for someone else to grow and learn something new by taking on that own responsibility of my own. Activator, I like to pick on that one too. I regularly jumped in the middle of really hard projects, difficult tasks, and then just wanted to take them on as my own. But they weren't my own, so here I
Mm,
am, like jumping in on something that isn't really for me to take care of. And so that could, as you continue to do that, jumping into things that aren't yours, you can lead yourself to some burnout there too. So, and then my achiever, really happy to be busy, but this meant I was daily burning the candle on both ends. I talked to you a little bit about, the staying late. Well, it also meant I came in early because it was nice and quiet in the morning. So I'm in early, I'm doing the things I want to do. Those times, the beginning and end of the day, were like my most efficient times. And all the rest of the day, I was, really just handling fires. So it really left little time. By the time I get home, there's only a few more hours before we go to sleep. So it really was taking away from my time with my family. And that was starting to really hurt me too. And I'm not taking care of my own well-being because, as I told you, I wasn't a blender. So I'm not going to stop in the middle of the day to go like take an exercise class or have
yeah.
lunch with a friend or something because I just was happy to be busy. You know, I think understanding the needs of my top talents and really building those appropriate boundaries around them, I was able to align my values, and we talked about the values at the top of this, so I can use my talents to determine what really is most important for me to be doing. Now, that doesn't mean that there's parts of your job you can say, I'm not going to do that because that's not in line with my values, but you can start to see where, like for my responsibility, for example, using it as a funnel, I might be able to funnel the requests that are coming to me through my values. And if I really want to take ownership of that, or if this is a possible growth opportunity for someone else to learn to take ownership, to learn to take responsibility, to be accountable. So sometimes things are yours to take, and other times they maybe don't have to be. And who could be growing and learning from that experience? With Activator, understanding those needs of those talents, I needed to use my values as guardrails. Here we go again with the guardrails. And so I can continue to push forward with the things that were in my control. And if time allowed, I could jump and help others as long as I didn't take it over. So again, it was that, putting the guardrails there, what is mine, what isn't, and then having that. And then for achiever, if you'll let me add one last one, using my values to really help me prioritize my available energy resources. Like we said last time, there's only so much room on that plate, and we're not getting another bigger plate to
Yeah.
add stuff to, right, Chad?
Yeah. So it's just what I heard out of a lot of that was, you talked about the guardrails, but and those are the boundaries.
Yes.
But when we jump over those boundaries, when we disregard them, that's when the work-life integration can start to get a little screwy. Um,
Right. And it might
it's
feel good in the moment, but what you're doing is you're taking that energy from something that you meant it to go to something else, and you're putting it into work. And
yeah.
when you go back to like the family and friends, your own personal well-being, you see that the energy just isn't there. And so, that leads to things like, coming home from work, just being exhausted and just like plopping down on the couch, and we're going to like numb out to something on Netflix for hours and then just go to bed and do the whole thing the next day. Over time, that chronic stepping over those boundaries, over those guardrails really do start to add up.
So I want to flip this though. We've talked a little bit about the dangers of some of our themes. I think
Yeah.
one of the things for our listeners and our leaders out there, in terms of thinking about your work style and how your talent themes can actually help you. There are a
Yeah.
couple areas that I thought I'd like to highlight. One is
I would love that.
think about sort of the importance of your brings and needs. And this is an activity that Jen and I as coaches will often bring a lot of our coachees through. Each
Mm-hmm.
of our talent themes has a certain things that they bring to teams or our personal work, and then also things that we tend to need from others. It might be space, it might be relationships, it might be certain ways of presenting information. Like I don't do well with anecdotes, I like solid data, but that's a
Yeah.
need I have. Okay. So I think some of the things that you'd want to think about as you start to think about your own work style um, are what are those needs? So for example, I'm going to use myself. My I need time to think. That feeds my deliberative. Other people with, say, intellection might also need that time to think. People also might need a time frame, or what the layout of the day is going to be. So, again, that speaks to the responsibility that we've touched on a lot, maybe discipline or even a strategic, having a plan of
Yeah.
attack or having multiple options. Um, Maybe the need to balance multiple requests from people. So, how does your work style integrate with needing to be present to respond to people versus maybe that time alone to work by yourself? How does that impact your work style? And then
Yeah.
also just the need to work with others. You know, is that something that requires you to be maybe not remote, maybe not even hybrid, maybe you need to be present, and that's really going to impact that you want a lot of time together, which may actually
Mhm.
lead more to a splitter um, approach where you're fully invested with those around you for a certain period of time, and then you go off and do, family, friends, community things. So I think that that's one thing to really think about in terms of the brings and needs. I do think, I want to build on your comment around how our talents can help us
Yeah.
in thinking about our work-life integration. So again, I'm going to use that responsibility theme as a really good lead example. So if I'm in an environment that's predominantly splitter, that I'm definitely going to make sure that I am done. For me, it's I make sure I'm done at that 4:30, and then my responsibility is to move on to the next relationship that for
Hmm.
me predominantly in my family.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's um, community involvement. But I would also say that that responsibility helps me if I'm in more of a splitter environment, then I just know that I need to use that responsibility to make sure that I'm responsible for the work projects that need to be done, for a certain number of hours. And then, oh, I need to be responsible for helping my family out with
Yeah.
making sure that that piece of my life is taken care of, and then coming back and again being responsible for the work that needs to get done. This is also harkens back to our setting expectations episode, right? It's all
Yes.
about figuring out what people need for, you know, for them to bring their best.
Right.
And being very clear around how you best feed those needs that people have. Um, I would also say that my discipline, I've already hinted at a little bit, that's one that really helps me keep clear about the segments of my day. I mentioned those sort of layers of a
Good.
parfait. Um,
Hmm.
how are those getting defined? What's the recipe for that day? It also mentioned that um, not all my days have to be the same. We talked a little bit about this in season one
Hmm.
when we talked to Kristen O'Shea around discipline, that not all of our days have to look the same, but there is going to be a plan. There is going to be a segmentation,
Right.
and that often gets impacted by my individualization and my ranger and my discipline all coming together. So I would encourage just leaders thinking about this, like, how do your strengths help you define the best day so that you have the best work-life integration? But this is that aiming component that we often coach our people on, of how do you use your talents to achieve a goal. And in this case, in this episode, we're talking about the goal of having a really strong work-life integration. So then how do your talents apply to that goal?
Right.
Um, do
Yeah,
you have
those
any
are
other
great.
thoughts? I know.
Those are yeah, those are really great examples. It had me thinking about started to dip into my, 6 through 10, and I have a lot of relationship building themes in there. So where I see it the most is my relator and my adaptability. That really leads, and I think we talked about this before, maybe in our responsibility episode. Like I feel like that leads me to what I'm valuing as the most important thing, or helping me with my priorities of what I need to get done. And I think it's really good to understand that just because it works for you, just because you're a good splitter, doesn't mean that that would work well for someone else. And I think you hit that great with the expectations, talking about, what are the expectations of the team? How do we work well together? And I think this is a great place for us to segue right into, like, what managers, leaders can do to really help their teams be at their best. Do you want to start us?
Yeah. So I think the first one, and we've already sort of teed it up, which is ask, don't assume.
Yeah.
The short and sweetest version of that is ask, don't assume. Um, ask people what their preferred style is. They may appear to be a certain way, but they may be modifying their behavior based on their perception of their environment. So,
Oh,
for
yeah.
example, I've had previous work environments where it would have been very easy for a leader or even one of my colleagues to assume I was a splitter, because I would come in on time, I would leave on time, and then I would do, my other interests either before or after. As I've already outlined in this episode, I am very clearly, I would much prefer to be a blender where I can really, put some importance on my family and, my other interests. So
Chad,
Gallup,
if you
Gallup
don't,
actually has
if
some.
you, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think you were going to go right where I was going about the assumptions of the splitter style. Is that where you were going to that Gallup article?
No, well, I was actually first going to mention there are some great questions that leaders can consider
Oh, wow.
when thinking about how to ask about preferred styles. So,
Sure.
when are people most productive? So ask your people, each of them, when are you most productive? Jen, you've mentioned you tend to be an early riser. I've already mentioned I tend to be a night owl, and
I
I'm
don't.
very productive much later in the evening. So that's question one. What helps them get into flow? Isn't that a strengths-based question, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
when do
Sure
our talents
is.
really get us in flow? What is important for you outside of work? Help, understand what else people might be trying to integrate into
Yeah.
their lives. So use that question to think about, that integration piece. Fourth question, what does balance look like to you? Or you could modify that question, what does integration look like for you?
Integration. Mhm.
Okay. And then the last two is, if you could design your ideal work schedule for a day, what would that look like? Okay, so those are some great ways of opening up the conversation.
Yeah.
None of those questions lay anything in stone. it just opens up the conversation so that you the leader, and you, the individual contributor, can get on the same page of how do we structure your day to get the not only the most out of you, but the best out of you? How do we get your best energy and your best ideas? Um, so that's where I wanted to sort of finish that thought. That you were
Yeah.
taking us to a wonderful spot. I didn't mean to cut you
Well,
off, but that I want to make sure that we finish those questions for our
no,
leaders out there.
I'm glad you did. Yeah. And what had me, you caught me right away with that about the don't assume the style, because leaders were assuming that their frontline employees would prefer a blended style, a work style, when actually they found in this statistic that we found that it's like 62% of frontline employees would prefer a splitter style versus a blended. So it just goes to, and it just goes to the big conversation about the assuming, like don't ever assume,
Yeah.
because what might be their preference today might not be the preference for future. So, it might be in the season. So I know a lot of people have their kids in soccer or, different activities that, athletic activities that happen right after school. Well, if that's during your normal 9 to 5 kind of work day,
Yeah.
and you're not allowed to be there at those games, I could say in that moment, you probably wishing you were a blender so you could, take some time off, go see the game, and then come back to work after. So I think it's really good to as Chad said, with asking those questions, like what way do they prefer to work today? But don't just stop there. Ask them, like as things are going, maybe it's project specific that we want everybody to be splitters for a while because we need, to really get this project on its feet, or maybe it's season specific where it's okay, maybe during the summer people have more of a blended style because their kids are home, and or during COVID we had to have a blended style because kids were home and we were teaching and everything at the same time. But I think it's really important that we just keep checking in often to make sure that's working for them. They might think they're a splitter and come to find out they're really better at being a blender, or vice versa.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you bringing in some of the additional stats around that and
Yeah.
helping us expand that. I wanted to make sure that I touch on one other thing that I think leaders could, actually two other things leaders could do differently. One is, and this goes to one of the principles that Gallup really espouses, which is to extend trust and assume positive intent. They kind of go hand in hand in this as we talk about this topic. So trust that people are, setting the boundaries that are right for them and allow them to bring their best to the work that they do. That they are going to set the right boundaries. Um, Obviously, if there's something that's a little out of whack or something's not going quite right, then you again want to go back to those questions that we were just talking about. What is your best work style? What is, when are you most productive? Um, and just re-explore that a little bit. But I think on the whole, um, leaders tend to assume a little bit more, or think that they've got to put down certain guardrails preemptively and
Yes.
not have the trust. If you're hiring good people, trust them to do the work and do it
Thank
in the
you.
way that
Yeah.
they're supposed to. And also, it goes to that positive intent. Assume people are there to do good work, not just to slack. Um, so I think that's one. The other thing, and I think this is a really sort of tangible, actionable stuff that I'm going to recommend is um, thank people for having boundaries. So I know a lot of organizations have, walls, or, employee of the month or employee of the week, or, gold star for the day, whatever it is. There are tons of rewards for that. But when was the last time you recognized somebody for leaving promptly at 4:30 or not working on a Saturday? And thinking about allowing them to be recognized for having maybe a more ideal integration where they are balancing things that are non-work related and having that get equal importance or greater importance. So I think that that's something really tangible that our leaders could be thinking about doing is recognizing people for setting boundaries and then honoring them um, as they approach their work. So
Yeah.
that was
I,
be my thing. What do you think leaders should be doing differently, or do you want to build on anything I've just said?
I, yeah, actually, I do want to build on one of the things you just said because I was thinking about that trust and leading with positive intent. So many people were afraid about their, so many managers, leaders were afraid about their workforce going home because did that mean like they weren't going to be working? Did that mean they were going to be, like taking all this time off and doing these other things and not actually focusing on their work? And I think what most people realize is that when you give people the freedom, when you give them that trust and lead with that positive intent, already assuming that they're going to do their best work, whatever way is best for them, they actually do great work. And for those that don't, that are struggling, it's a place where you can have a conversation. It doesn't mean that they're sloughing off or that they don't like their work or they're trying to get paid to do nothing. It might mean that there's something else going on. Maybe they can't work well from home because they have some other family engagements. This goes back to that conversation Chad had at the beginning about the really understanding and asking people, what else do you have going on in your life? What is important to you outside of work? Because some of those things might be getting in the way. So it's back to that, having those good, deep conversations with your people, and you'll know if they're working or not. Like that's not a surprise. I mean, you can tell when people are working and when they're not. And so, just having the open door for that conversation to happen really will help you continue to grow that trust between your employees and yourself.
Jen, as we think about wrapping this up, we've touched about a lot of things, positive trust, setting expectations. What are maybe some of your closing ideas or thoughts you have? Maybe it's for leaders, maybe it's for individual contributors,
Sure.
that you'd love to wrap this show up with.
I think for everybody across the board, it goes to that saying, where your attention goes, energy flows, right? If you've heard that
Mm,
before. So what you give your attention will get your energy. So I want you to just really, as leaders, as individual contributors, as managers, just people, where are you putting your energy right now? Is your attention and your time spent in line with your values? Chad and I are Gallup Lipton Strengths coaches, and we do values work with our clients because sometimes this is important to understand that our own personal values and the values of the company, really how these blend together. So when you can clearly define your values, you're more able to put your energy to those things that are the most important to you. You can set and keep those boundaries. Again, not just setting them, you have to keep them too.
right.
And then really use your talents with purpose and intention. And this goes back to the not letting them run amok, having the guardrails there, and really, aiming, as Chad said earlier in this episode, aiming your talents towards those things that you value and your energy resources that you have, because our
Yeah.
plate doesn't get any bigger.
Right. Yeah.
How about you,
It's
Chad?
all, yeah. So just to finish out that analogy, it's about integrating the plate, right? Really great
That's
chefs
right.
love to blend all the tastes and flavors so
There
they
you
all mix
go.
together,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So
Yeah.
building off that point, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I'd love all of our listeners to take away is just be really clear about your own work style. Jen and I have both mentioned sometimes it changes a little bit based on the season you're in, whether that's a life season or a yearly season. So I've got kids. Summer is very different than the rest of my school year time. Um,
Right.
but being very clear about your work style. If you're a leader, it's going to help you better understand how you might be impacting your people. If you're an individual contributor, it's going to improve that conversation you're going to end up having with your leader when they start asking you the questions that I outlined earlier. Having some clear answers about where your energy is and what you need from your leader and what you need from your schedule, and how those boundaries are going to be set is going to be super important. You're going to have a better work experience because of it. Um, the other thing that I'm just bringing up, this is sort of a new idea, but it ties into everything we've talked about, is that there's a great, I think it was a commencement speech by the ex-CEO of Coca-Cola. His name is Brian Dyson, and he was one of the people that popularized the 5 balls of life idea. So if you have a ball for family, for work, for your friends, for your health, and for your spiritual life, 4 of those are glass. Work is the one that is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it'll bounce back. If you drop any of the others, you scuff it, you break it, you mar it in some way. So I think understanding how those 5 balls get integrated and how you juggle them, how you integrate them is super important. Because work as it's important, and as we've talked about today, there's a lot to be accomplished there. But making sure that you integrate them well and having those boundaries and what you're going to prioritize to have in the air or what you're going to hold is super important. So that'd be my
Oh,
final thought to round us out.
I love that one, Chad. I had someone tell me at work before when I was, maybe pushing my own boundaries a bit and staying too much. They're not going to put a big black shroud over my chair when I'm gone, but my family sure will miss me. So I think you're absolutely right. We do have all those glass balls and they won't bounce back the way work would. Yeah. So good.
So as you consider everything that we've talked about, and Jen and I have also mentioned that we do plenty of coaching around this, but as you live and work and want some help going through your life, I'm just going to keep encouraging you to keep playing to your strengths.
And be uniquely you.
And with that, we'll see you later. If you like this episode, we encourage you to like, follow, and subscribe to wherever you find your podcasts.